So in this video, we're going to be talking about quadratics and quadratic equations and functions. So a quadratic function is one that comes in the form y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And it will always come in that form. So the first thing we want to be able to do is learn how to graph these. And so there's a couple different steps that we can follow in order to graph a quadratic function or equation. The first thing that you want to do is to determine if your graph is going to open up or down. Now, a quadratic function will always take a parabolic shape, so it will either look something like that or like that. So this would be considered opens up, and this one opens down. And so in order to determine if it's going to open up or down, you're going to look at this a term right here. And if a is greater than 0, it's going to open up. And if a is less than 0 or a is negative, it's going to open down. Then the next thing you're going to want to do is to find an axis of symmetry. And the equation for that is going to be x is equal to the opposite of b all over 2a. Then once you find that, you're going to find a vertex. Now, your vertex is this point right here. It's either the bottom of your curve or the very top of your curve. All right, and then the axis of symmetry actually acts right through that, and it's symmetric on either side of this line or axis of symmetry, which is where it gets its name. So in order to find your vertex, you're going to go ahead and plug in this value here into your function and solve for y, and that will give you your point x and y of your vertex. So plug in opposite of b over 2a for x and solve for y. So you'll end up with your vertex being a point opposite of b over 2a and whatever y you come up with that. And then next you're going to plot 2 points on either side. So one on each side of your axis of symmetry. And then finally, you're going to draw your curve. So let's go ahead and do an example of that. Let's go ahead and just use y equals x squared plus 6x plus 4 as ours. So the first thing we want to determine is if our curve is going to open up or down. Now, a in this case, there's nothing out in front of our x here, so it's just 1, and it's a positive 1. So a is greater than 0, so we know that our graph is going to open up. And now we want to find our axis of symmetry. So x equals opposite of b over 2a. So the opposite of 6 all over 2 times 1, it's going to be negative 3. So if we're drawing this, over here, we know that x equals -3. This is going to be our axis of symmetry here. So our curve will be symmetric about that line. Now, our next step is to find our vertex. So we're going to go ahead and plug this value into our original equation. So y equals x squared, or -3 squared, plus 6 times -3 plus 4. Notice that I've replaced this -3 with all of the x's in our original function. All right, and then we just solve for y. So that's going to equal 9 minus 18 plus 4. It's going to be -9 plus 4. That's going to be -5. So our vertex is going to be the point -3, -5. And we can go ahead and plot that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's our vertex there. All right, and so then our next is going to be plot 2 points on both sides of, so 1 point on each side of the axis of symmetry. And what I like to do is I just like to be consistent. So I'm going to plug in x equals -2 and then x equals -4. So I just move one space over on either side of the axis of symmetry. So for -4, that's going to be y equals -4 squared plus 6 times 4 plus 4. And for -2, we're going to get y equals -2 squared plus 6 times 2 plus 4. All right, and then you just solve these. So 16 plus 6, oops, that's a -4. So that should be minus 24 plus 4. So that's going to be equal to 16 minus 20 equals -4. And then over here for -2, y equals 4 minus 12 plus 4. So that's going to be equal to 4 minus 8, which is equal to -4. And that's really good that these match up because, again, we have to stay symmetric. So you can go ahead and plot these points. So this is going to be -4, -4, and this one's going to be -2, -4. All right, so we'll plot these points up here on our graph. So -4, -4, and then -2, -4. All right, and then you can just draw your curve. All right, and that's how you would graph that. Now, another way that you can graph these is by factoring. So we won't go through an example, but I'll go ahead and give you the steps. So the first thing you're going to want to do is factor your quadratic. So it'll be in the form of x plus, what terms do we want to use? X plus some number d times x plus some number e equals 0. So then you're going to solve. So that's going to be y equals these, right? And so then after you factor, the next thing you're going to want to do is find your x-intercepts. By setting y equal to 0. So you'll have x plus d, x plus e equals 0, and you can solve for x. And so on this graph, you'll have 2 points. Let's call this D and this E that lie on the x-axis. So then next you're going to find your vertex. And so then you'll have this down here as your vertex. And then you can go ahead and plot. Now again, it doesn't matter which method you use for graphing, just whatever you're more comfortable with. All right, so now let's talk about solving quadratic equations for a little bit. There are a few different methods you can use. The first one would be by graphing. And your solutions are actually where it crosses the x-axis. So in that case, it would be D and E would be your solutions. All right. But another method would be, again, to factor and then solve for x, like we've done previously in a different video right before this. And then another way would be to use square roots. And this would happen when you had something along the lines of 2x squared minus 72 equals 0. And you're asked to solve for x. So of course you're going to want to isolate x. So we're going to add 72 to both sides. So we're going to be left with 2x squared equals 72. Divide each side by 2. And we'll get x squared equals 36. And then at this point, in order to get rid of this squared here, the opposite of squaring something is taking the square root of it. So these here will cancel and you'll be left with x. Now if we take the square root on one side of the equation, we have to take the square root on the other side of the equation as well. So the square root of 36 is going to be 6. And when you take a square root, you get a positive and negative solution. So plus or minus 6 would be your answer to that using square roots. And then finally, you can use something called completing the square. Now, this is helpful when you're given a quadratic that can't be factored easily. So for this example, let's go ahead and look at this quadratic equation here, x squared plus 8x plus 10 equals 0. Now, I can't easily factor this, so we're going to go ahead and use this method called completing the square. So the first thing you're going to want to do is separate variables from constants. And all that means is anything up here that doesn't have a variable attached to it, you're going to flip to the other side of the equation. So we're going to go ahead and subtract 10 from both sides. So we'll be left with x squared plus 8x equals negative 10. Then the next thing you're going to want to do is complete the square. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to rewrite this equation up here as so. So x squared plus 8x plus something. And we're going to fill this something in with a number that will make this a perfect square when it's factored. and that's going to be equal to negative 10. And again, whatever you do to one side of your equation, you've got to do to the other side. So we're going to go ahead and add that same blank on that side of the equation as well. Now, what goes into this blank here is going to be b over 2 squared. So in this case, we've got 8 as our b in this equation. So we're going to have 8 over 2 squared. So that's going to be 4 squared. And we're going to keep it in this form to make our factoring a little bit easier. So if we rewrite this, we're going to have x squared plus 8x plus 4 squared equals negative 10 plus 4 squared. Now we can go ahead and factor this side here. So the easiest way to do that is going to be to just start at the same, write your parentheses, and then x, and then whatever this value is inside here goes on both sides here. Now you've got to figure out your signs that are going to go in the parentheses, and we need these two numbers here to add up to 8. And so in order to do that, both of your 4's need to be positive, because 4 plus 4 equals 8. All right, so we've got that figured out, and then on this side we can go ahead and just combine terms here. So negative 10 plus our 4 squared is going to be 16. So we're going to end up with a positive 6 on that side. So we're going to go ahead and rewrite this. So we've got 2x plus 4, so we can go ahead and rewrite it as x plus 4 squared equals 6. Again, to get rid of that square root, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we're going to be left with x plus 4. And remember, when you take the square root, you're going to do a plus or minus the square root of 6. And then you just isolate your x. We're going to subtract 4 from both sides. So we're going to be left with our solution as x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 6. And that's our answer. All right. So that's that. And then finally, the last method you can use for solving quadratic equations is going to be to use the quadratic formula. Which is given as x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And then we'll just use this example here to show that we're going to get the same answer either way. So x is equal to the opposite of b, so the opposite of 8 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 8 squared minus 4ac, so 4 times 1 times 10, all over 2a, so 2 times 1. And then we just simplify this. So that's going to be equal to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 40 all over 2, negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 24 all over 2. Now we can simplify the square root of 24 by running a prime factorization. So 2 times 12, 2 times 6, 2 times 3. So as we can see, there's 2 2's, so we can pull a 2 out, and then we'll be left with 2 times 3 in the square root. So we'll be left with negative 8 plus or minus this 2 square roots of 6 all over 2. Now we can simplify this by dividing each term on the top by 2. So we're going to be left with negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 6. And as you can see, we get the same answer either way. So again, it doesn't matter which method you use to solve these quadratics, as long as you understand that method. Totally up to you to decide. But that's just a quick look at quadratic equations and functions, and how to solve these equations and how to graph them.